Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about less developed countries. First, I want to mention a review question, which I may or may not put up in the discussion section. The question is, why theoretically might there be a correlation between the choice of political systems, for example, presidential versus parliamentary, SMD versus PR, and the success of democratization in post-communist countries? So I want you to think about the post-communist legacy, various aspects of the communist experience, and apply these various political systems, electoral systems to these, and discuss which one might be best and how they might help determine the success of democratization. Today we're going to talk about less developed countries. In many ways, we define the world in political economic terms. It used to be the first world, the second world, and the world, and the third world, but this is problematic. When I lived in Uzbekistan, walking down the streets, you might wonder whether it was a third world or second world country. It was an authoritarian regime. There were animals in the streets. My dog was chased by a bull. People would burn trash, so you had poor disposal services, poor public services in general. On the other hand, you had universities, buses, trams, fairly modern airport. Going back to the downside, you have a political culture which is largely focused on clientelism, or accepts clientelism, a patriarchal system where women are primarily subservient. So lots of questions. Is this a first or a second world? Well, it's clearly not a first world country. Is it second or third world? What does that mean? For a long time, it used to be the second world were the communist countries, the first world were the Western capitalist countries, and the third world was everyone else. And so if you look at this map, these were the third world for a very long time. So the West versus the communists versus the rest. Now we take on a slightly more nuanced terminology. There's another way, more developed versus less developed, and then you see, of course, it's the North versus the South, right? With the exception, obviously, of Australia and New Zealand. Today, we tend to look more at newly industrializing countries as separate entities. These are countries that are characterized by rapid economic growth. But they also have a tendency to, over time, move towards democracy. And we can ask why. And if you go back to the first day's discussion, we could talk about modernization theory. But the important thing is that these countries have been pulled out to contrast them from what we call less developed countries, which is the majority, which don't seem to actually move. So newly industrializing countries have rapid economic growth, tend to move towards more democratic structures. Less developed countries tend to be economically stagnant. They tend to be violent. They tend to be characterized by civil strife. Both NICs and LDCs are remnants of empire for the most part. And today they have relatively low levels of civil and political rights compared to advanced democracies. But as I said, the less developed countries are in a much worse condition. The newly industrialized countries are actually moving very quickly. And in fact, if you look at Mexico, it's fallen back on the Freedom House score of late. From the 2008, it was actually green and fully free. Today it's labeled as partly free. But Brazil is a newly industrializing country which is green, which is completely free. Turkey is partly free. China remains not free. India remains completely free. South Africa completely free. So there's a bit of a mixed bag here. But now LDCs are going to be definitely characterized by lower levels of civil and political rights even than NICs, and certainly compared to advanced democracies. High levels of inequality. But NICs, the difference between LDCs and NICs, again, NICs are moving much faster towards both of these things, towards higher levels of civil and political rights, greater levels of equality, and strong institutionalization. So in order to understand the place of LDCs and NICs today, we need to start with the concept of empire, because these are all remnants of empire. We can define empires as the single political authorities that have under their sovereignty a large number of external regions or territories and different peoples. Imperialism is therefore the extension of state power to control territory, resources, and peoples outside of one's borders. Colonialism is different, and you have to understand the difference between colonialism and imperialism. Colonialism involves actual permanent physical occupation, whether through military force, business, other settlers, In a way, it's sort of empire plus. There's this hands-on administration. You can have empires where you simply have control over the population. You can come and tax them when you want or collect tributes, which we'll see in some of the case studies. Colonial states are much more hands-on. Europe has historically been the colonizer in chief, although we've had other colonizing states, Japan, for example, which we'll talk about. But Europe, if you think about it, had many good reasons to get involved. So some theoretical reasons we might come up with. Think about the geostrategic motives, the economic and strategic motives. You had this evolutionary trend that we talked about before in day 2 on state building, where you had these various proto-states competing with their neighbors and strengthening through these various things. And then they decided to, once they had strengthened, they decided to go out and conquer other lands far and away, because of the goods and the prestige that they conferred upon these states back at home. Another idea might be a cultural angle, religious and cultural angle. There was frequently talk about a civilizing mission. Often missionaries would go, and they would be a fulcrum of the colonial empire, building up, for example, the educational network. Okay, Christianity being a proselytizing religion, the idea being that you have to spread it if you're a good believer. So that might be another reason that the Europeans were so focused on this expansion outward. For whatever reason, this really starts with Spain and Portugal. And it started in Central and South America. At first, when these guys got to Central and South America, they didn't think that there was much that was of any interest. But then the Spaniards opened silver mines in Mexico. And in the 1540s, they began to ship large shipments of silver back to the home state, back to Spain. By the 16th century, Spain had the equivalent of $1.5 trillion in 1990 terms in gold and silver that it had received from what they called New Spain. Now, the problem, of course, was what to do with all that wealth. Like we talked about when we talked about political economy, if you have a lot of money coming in, you tend to find inflation. Think about OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. Back in the 1970s, you had major inflation in OPEC states because they had all these petrodollars coming in. Well, in Spain, you had the same thing. All this gold and silver coming in, which led to inflation by the end of the 16th century. And imports also diverted investment away from other forms of industry. Still, Spain struck gold, and this became a new model for Europe. Later, so you had the Brits, the Portuguese going into Brazil, and we'll talk about and some other parts of Africa and Asia in particular, around India and other places. We'll talk about the Portuguese experience in more detail later with respect to Brazil. This spreads the British Empire. This is a picture of the British Empire in the 19th century, but by the 17th century, the British, the French, the Dutch, they're all envious of the great wealth that Spain and Portugal have gotten out of their empires. And so they go to North America, North Africa, the Middle East, then the rest of Africa, and to much of Japan. And they go outward. So here's a picture of the French Empire and the growth of the French Empire. Here's a picture of the Italian Empire. Don't think about the Italian Empire. They had one. Here's a picture of the Ottoman Empire. The Turks going north into Europe. The Turks going west into North Africa. And then the Japanese Empire. The Japanese going primarily east and south, taking over much of Asia during the interwar period and through World War II. So we're going to talk about imperial legacy in just a moment. We'll take a quick break.